All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Urban Fantasy Panel, Urban Fantasy and Sociological Themes. And basically, I think the title says it all. So I'm your moderator slash host, I guess, Stephen B. Pearl. I write urban fantasy, specifically Nuki Kubai. The first book of the Chronicles of Ray McAndrews. The second and third books should be out sometime in the next year. They're with the publisher now for editing. And Worlds Apart, a urban fantasy adventure, paranormal romance, if you want to push it. So let's have everybody introduce themselves. Heidi.
Oh, hi. I was just hanging out. No, my name is Heidi Angell. For those who don't know me, that's Angel with two L's because I'm not that kind of angel. And I have a urban fantasy slash horror book about those who believe that vampires should be killed, not kissed. And I have a paranormal psychic series that I enjoy sharing with the world.
Okay. Alex.
I'm Alex G Zarate. I'm an author, artist, and photographer. I write urban fantasy and sci-fi. I've got 5 books currently in the urban fantasy genre, a little bit in the supernatural suspense, and I'm working on the next one.
Okay. Cheryl?
Hi, my name is Cheryl Lynn. I'm from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I am the author of The Black Moon of Lilith, an urban fantasy slash supernatural horror story about a librarian's assistant who finds the Grim Reaper's cloak.
Ooh. Catherine?
Hi, I'm Catherine Fitzsimmons. I am the author of 5 books and the owner of Brain Lag, a publisher of science fiction and fantasy books based outside Toronto, Canada. We currently have 12 authors and 22 titles released.
Go Brain Lag! Liz?
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Hirst, and I am an author of horror and fantasy books and stories. And my latest book, Just an Early Warning, is part of the Singing Bones trilogy, which is, well, it's the first of the Singing Bones trilogy, which is a sci-fi horror series, which is actually very close to urban fantasy. I think would be of a lot of interest to urban fantasy readers because it does have that flavor as well.
Okay, well, I'm going to toss out a little bit of a talking point, and then we can all kick it around. I think one of the great strengths of urban fantasy, and it's a strength shared with science fiction, is that you can do allegories to address issues that if you just came out and said it, we're talking about the oppression of people of color, immediately people turn off. But if you make it elves living in our society, hidden and moving through, or a recognizable group like, okay, werewolves are overdone, but let's say werewolves being oppressed like they are in the Laurel K. Hamilton books, then you can say a lot. What do people think about that? And we'll start off with you, Heidi, unless you just want to lurk for this.
I'm okay with lurking. I am showing, was Erin Casey supposed to be on this panel?
Just let me click a couple of buttons.
Okay, and if somebody else wants to chime in on the discussion real quick while he and I figure out how to get Erin in here, okay?
So I'll just jump in because I think it's not just that fantasy can be used as metaphor. Fantasy is a metaphor. You know, all these books, whether it's urban fantasy or epic fantasy or even historical fantasy, it's not about elves and wizards and dragons and whatever. It's about perseverance and injustice and, you know, doing the right thing, even in the face of, you know, all the bad stuff out there. So it's definitely not just ripe for it, but it's almost an expectation of fantasy that you're using it as a connection. And I think that's the beautiful thing about fantasy, is that it's not just a genre for outsiders, but it's also universal.
Mm.
Okay. Cheryl?
Oh, yeah, that was very well said. I especially liked it's not just, oh, now I just forgot the phrasing. I should have wrote it down when you said it. But it is universal, and fantasy is in many ways, I think, escapist. So I think a lot of people who are in marginalized communities do really like fantasy. Like, for example, I was talking to a friend who's writing a book, and we were talking about how we sneak in references to gamer culture. Because as kids, we weren't very popular, so we would just stay home alone and play video games. And, I feel like a lot of that comes through in our writing as well. So like you said, it's not just about the dragons and stuff. It's also about, different
About
kinds
us.
of themes.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like in Tolkien. That's it was so many things in Tolkien about the ravages of war and how you can have so many people coming together to end something, which you have so many armies that are trying to come together and just fuel their conflicts. And I remember an interview with like Stan Lee. He mentioned the X-Men were created out of the notion of discrimination, and they were the marginalized outcasts that everyone was after and attacking on a regular basis, and it was no other reason than they were different. And he says that was the reason why so many people related to them, because everyone feels like an outsider at some point.
Okay. Liz? You have to
there we
unmute.
go. There we go. Unmuted. Okay. I think that's definitely true. I really personally in my own work like playing with that. With the connection between the fantasy world and our world. In fact, the Singing Bones universe is kind of connected to like a high fantasy universe in this weird interdimensional way. But they never cross. They never cross, but they're connected in that they have some of the same like gods and stuff that come through and evil spirits and things like that. But they do end up connected in really strange ways through one psychic girl writing these what she thinks are stories, but she's really just getting transmissions from Ilaria. So but yeah, I think it's really interesting how we can do sort of a metaphor to the real world. Like, for instance, I know this isn't so much an urban fantasy, but who here's read the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin? Please read it. It's really, really good. It is the most, I don't know how it doesn't sort of somehow count as horror, because wow, there's some really chilling bits in it. And it's just the most eloquent dissection of racism in a society. But it's not necessarily racism based on skin color, it's based on people being having powers to manipulate the earth and geological functions. And it's just fantastic. Please read it. I ate it up in like a few months. And these are huge books. So
Okay. I'm sorry, it has the Writers Room Nonprofit Corporation where your name should be, but why don't you introduce yourself and give us a bit of your thought on this? It's allegory and fantasy.
Sorry, actually, I think is this the urban fantasy and societal themes one? Okay,
Yes.
just making sure. So I'm Erin Casey. I apologize that it's logged in as the Writers' Rooms. I'm the director of the Writers' Rooms, which is a nonprofit corporation that focuses on providing a free, safe environment to all writers. So we're basically writers helping writers. So I love to promote it anyway, so it's fitting that it shows up here. I'm an urban fantasy author of the Purple Door District. I have 2 books out, which is Purple Door District and Wolf Pit. And the 3rd book in the trilogy should be coming out this, hopefully this December. One of the things that I really wanted to focus on in the books was a discussion of society and societal elements. The stories themselves are set in Chicago, so I wanted to make sure that my characters were diverse as a proper representation of Chicago, both as human, but also have parahumans in there, which are like my werewolves, vampires, werebirds, magi, etc. And I've been trying to be very careful about not being too, I guess you can say, use too many faux pas or be racially insensitive when I'm writing about these characters. I really do love reading books that are heavily diverse because then you have a better representation of the world around us and of society as a whole.
Okay.
And if
Oh,
sorry,
go ahead.
I was just going to add that I think urban fantasy, in a way, is even more apropos a genre for delving into this, because so much urban fantasy out there, the magic side, the monster side, is sort of hidden from the regular people. So it's kind of a genre about outsiders in the first place. So it's really a great opportunity to, help bring more voice to marginalized communities of any type.
I really agree with you, Catherine. Oh, go ahead, Elizabeth.
I actually wrote my master's work on this topic. Catherine, you touched on something that's really exciting to me. So my master's work was on Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone as it relates to sort of mental geographies and post-colonialism. So one thing that I found that was really interesting, I studied Victorian pulp literature and contemporary fantasy in my English studies. And one of the things that I found most interesting was in the 19th century boys novel and the adventure novel, adventure and magic are out there. You know, you have to go far off into these unexplored wildernesses. King Solomon's Mines, they go to Africa, or they go to the Treasure Island, or they go someplace out there, way out there, and they find magic. But then you see something really interesting happening as we come to the middle and the end of the 20th century, which is that, like the British Empire, because I was mostly focusing on England, like the British Empire, the magic has come home to roost. And so now the magic is sort of mapped out as underneath regular society, which is a really interesting metaphor when you're thinking about, all of the amazing and interesting cultures and peoples of the world sort of diversifying and coming into, colonizing countries, and, this kind of way that it's playing out on people's psyches and their way they're writing it. So that's my master's work. So it's very interesting how that played out, actually.
Yeah, and I'll just give a quick plug for one of your other works. Love, Time, Space, and Magic is through Pop Seagull Publishing, which is Liz's baby. So, and it was a great collection of short stories. My tie to this, actually, I don't need allegory in urban fantasy to be applicable to me, because I've been out of the broom closet for 45 years. I'm dyed-in-the-wool pagan. And as such, we have a lot of representation in urban fantasy. And a lot of the time, sadly, it is very wrong. But one thing that it tends to get is pagans/magic folk being looked on with suspicion until somebody runs into something and they need somebody who can deal with the spooky side of life. And then suddenly, for a brief moment, you're valued. And then they go back to hating you, which is, it's become less over the years, but 20 years ago, it was actually quite a problem. So how much research do you folks do to try to get those nuts and bolts about real living populations in your works to fly well? And we'll start with Alex and work around.
I don't put too much research into it. I draw on my own life and the experiences I've had, the people I've met. There are compilations of characters that are from real people I've known and things I've experienced over the years. I've moved several times, so I've met different people from different parts of the U.S. I've been in the military for 8 years, so I had a very wide range of people I got to meet that way as well. But I don't do as much research. It's more I just draw on my own experiences, and I put in situations that I've come across and put them in this fantasy world and deal with them in that way. That way I can put them in with those characters and hopefully encourage others to see that you can overcome bullies and people who just are hateful despite the different things that you're born with or unable to change about yourself.
Cheryl?
I want to build off of what Alex said, but also what Erin said earlier about how your story was taking place in Chicago, I believe. And so you base, your story on, the real world Chicago. And that's kind of what I'm doing with mine. And like Alex said, it's just drawing from my own experiences. So in my own experiences, like 99% of people I know are Hispanic or Latino or mixed race. So that's represented in my book. And the kind of problems that we face are also represented in the book. So it's just with the fantasy setting,
Hey, Catherine?
So I'm going to out myself here and admit that I have not yet written urban fantasy that, I probably wrote some, I don't know, maybe short stories or something long ago that are rightfully gathering dust on a hard drive. But I have not actually gone that route yet. But in general, I am developing some stories, and certainly for anything that takes place in the real world and at a certain point in time and with certain people, I want it to be authentic, because I think it's important to ground fantasy in as much reality as possible. And especially because it is a genre that you can use to explore, these different themes and these different hardships that people go through. So in terms of the research, I guess it would depend on the project. I'm doing development for an urban fantasy that I plan to take place in Austin, Texas, which is where I lived before moving here to Canada. So there will be a little bit of my own memories there, but the characters are not necessarily going to be in the same places I was. So, having to go back through maps of the city, maybe newspaper articles, things like that, of the time period where it takes place, as well as, maybe books or something, try to figure out what the overall like cultural feeling was for the city and try to grasp that in the work is what I'm going to try to focus on when I actually sit down to do it after I finish my epic fantasy trilogy.
Okay. Liz?
So I think I've had some sensitivity readers in the past, especially when I had First Nations characters in the Fading Bones trilogy. I have a really great sensitivity reader. It's my husband's best friend, Leonard. He's just a really great guy, and he's always willing to be honest with me about where I'm going wrong, and where I'm going right. So, but I think in general, I'm one of those people that soaks up people's stories anyway. Like, I'm just really, really interested in listening to people, and I listen to people of all different, cultures and ways of being. And I like to listen to where people are coming from and understand. I like to listen and understand to people that are different from me, and I'm just really interested in those kinds of stories and people's different voices. So I read a lot of books by authors with different backgrounds from myself. I watch on social media, I look online, and I would say that whenever I write a character, and this is the most important thing I think for me, and it's always garnered me a lot more, I think, leeway with my sensitivity readers, is I always just write my characters as people first. I go, what would a human being do in this situation? Not what would a person of this race or faith or disability or whatever do in this situation. And, I make it more about their personality and who they are as a person at the base of it, rather than any of those outward things that kind of divide us. You know what I mean? And so I've always had really good luck with that.
Big cyber hug to you, Liz.
Aw.
Big cyber hug.
Hugs to you, Stephen.
Erin?
So I do a bit of a mix of research, but also own experiences or own voice. So I came out as bisexual a few years ago. So I am very adamant about writing about LGBT characters in the books, especially LGBT characters who end up together and we don't follow the trope of one of them getting killed off, because that happens a lot. But some of it's been research wise, it's more on you mentioned like the witchcraft magic. That actually goes back to when I was working on some of my medieval fantasy books, because I was learning a lot about paganism, herbology, and I've done a lot of research on that to create my own apothecary in my book to make sure that it's filled with different elements. And there's actually an apothecary in the town where I live that I often go to and kind of get a feel for what it's like there and what herbs and items they sell, but also staying true to like pagan beliefs and not trying to whitewash it essentially. I think it's important to have, like I mentioned, it's important to have diverse characters in there, which is why I try to write about a lot of different nationalities. But like Liz mentioned, I have sensitivity readers who will read my stuff to make sure I'm being sensitive. I totally agree with Liz that you need to write the characters as people first, but you also don't want to forget about their culture and those aspects of the characters to bring them in. So yes, I'm a white bisexual female, but I have Black characters, Native American. I have one with a character with disability, and other histories and backgrounds that I try to have people review to make sure I'm not making a mistake and offending people. It's going to happen, I know that, but I'm trying to do my best to make it as sensitive while representing these different groups. But the research definitely helps with that. And the main series of that the Purple Door District branches off of, I'm writing with a co-author named A.E. Keller, and she has history in medical background, so like I can use that information in the book as well. So that's really helpful too.
Okay. um, sorry, magic in urban fantasy is equivalent to empowerment. And I think it's a great allegory for puberty and the changes that are going on there, which we saw a lot in the X-Men, as Alex mentioned. So does anybody want to riff on that concept? The idea of it's growing up.
I would like
Okay.
to bring in an interesting language note, if I may.
Okay.
I think it's really interesting, and I actually really like the way magic is referred to sometimes in French. I've been reading The Hobbit in French recently because I'm trying to get fluency in French, and then I want to move on to Japanese, and I want to know a lot of different languages, and it's kind of my life project. But the thing that I'm finding really interesting is a lot of times when they refer to magic powers in French, it's pouvoir, which is the same as can. So it's like actual, the can do power kind of thing. Like power is the same thing as the can. So I think it's really interesting that there's sort of this intrinsic linguistic link in French between magic powers and like agency. So that's my note. That's my note. Go ahead.
Oh,
yeah,
this
one of the
is great as long as it doesn't blow up. Canadian
one of the
joke
things
about
about
nuclear power.
yeah.
Alex.
As you were mentioning about the X-Men, and like I said, I saw the interview with Stanley where he talks about it, and a lot of times, they mention how it's during extreme emotions that the mutants develop these powers, and it's always during puberty, and that's pretty much the way teenagers are when you're suddenly having to deal with puberty and you're dealing with all these new emotions and these new things happening in your life. It's very hard to stay grounded. And, characters like the X-Men at least show you what happens when, people look at you differently just because of this one situation. And that's always a very good thing to be able to show, readers that you're not alone. Everyone has this feeling of being an outsider at some point. And as we're growing up, we grow into ourselves, but puberty is the hardest time. So like you were saying, when magic comes into play, it helps the characters to grow up and to be, more of what everyone else wants to become.
Well, and I think, sorry, I know I said I was just going to sit and observe, but we started talking about X-Men. I love X-Men. One of the things that I loved about X-Men is that it kind of mimics the struggle that teenagers go through in trying to learn how to control themselves, but also in, as you become a teenager, it goes, when kids are little, they all play together on the playgrounds. There isn't this whole, oh, well, he's in a wheelchair, I can't talk to him. There isn't this, oh, they're of a different race or a different religion, I can't associate them. Mentality, that's something that they learn, and that becomes more common middle school into high school. And throwing magic into it gives you an outside force to be able to look at, how we categorize people differently because of what house they're in Harry Potter, or because of what type of magic gifts they develop, like in the mutants. And it's watching how we're doing that and then talking about how we do that and how that hurts and how we make assumptions about people based on, and it's a safe way of addressing the assumptions that we already make as we're going through that transition, and how that hurts and how that shapes how we become as people. So that was something that I always loved about X-Men too.
Well, and the other thing on the flip side of that is that, in the X-Men, it's not just about getting the powers, but it's about finding other people who have the same thing. And I think that's a key thing about urban fantasy, about any type of fantasy is the connection with other people. And it kind of goes back to the fact that it's kind of an outsider genre. These are people who reach out to fantasy because they don't fit in elsewhere. And I think that's something important to keep in mind when writing urban fantasy, is that, there needs to be that connection with other people. And there's a lot of different ways you can take that, whether it's through magic or, other things, but certainly magic as a metaphor for puberty seems to be particularly common in urban fantasy. There seems to be a lot of urban fantasy YA and, young adult, otherwise, new adult type urban fantasy. There are the exceptions, like the Dresden Files, who's, he's already well established in his magic, but a lot of it is about becoming, which is kind of the whole point.
And to kind sorry, I was
Go ahead.
just going to say, to kind of add on that, I mean, like Catherine and Heidi said, it's about finding your community, people are like you, and finding comfort in that, but growing up like with that power, and it's also a part the mental battle as well, because if suddenly you've lived this entire way your whole life and then all of a sudden you develop these amazing powers, you're not just going through a societal change, you're going through your own mental change as well. So you have to deal with the mental repercussions. And I'm thinking of Rogue from X-Men, who just wants love, but she physically can't touch somebody without taking in their powers or their life force. Like, how do you grow with that kind of mentality as well? So it's finding the societal support, but also finding the mental support as they're adjusting to all these changes. And mental health is such an important thing that really needs to be focused on too.
One of the things I love about the X-Men that spills over into urban fantasy, good urban fantasy, is the fact that the X-Men start, and yes, they have this natural aptitude, but it's just ticking over. And then through training and effort, you see the X-Men consistently, they do an arc of empowerment where they learn to master their abilities and they become far more powerful. And I see that in the Dresden Files too, because if you read the Dresden Files from Stormfront, the early books, as you go along, Harry is getting consistently more powerful till the point where in the latest book, he's actually being noticed by the major players as somebody who's dangerous and you don't cross. So I love that aspect of personal responsibility leading and learning, leading to greater power. Anybody have great examples or examples from your own work of that sort of evolutionary arc?
In my urban fantasy series, I have the main character, a little boy who connects with a cat that bestows upon him the ability to see thoughts and teleport. And through him, he grows and looks at the world and sees things that most people would never see. And that also gives him that lookout to be careful when you already see the dangers there is in revealing what you can do. So he ends up having to seclude himself. So he has that the loner mentality, and it's not until later books where he finds out that there are others like him. But in the very beginning, he's very secluded. He's constantly struggling to break off ties with friends and family. But he's a child when I start the series, so 8 years old, and then going into his teen years in the second series. So it's very hard to tell a story where your character is struggling throughout the whole process. But like you said, he grows and he becomes more adept at what he can do, and utilizing what he can do, he can actually become more mature, more responsible, and he can see the connections that are necessary for everyone's lives. And that's a very important part of every story that I put together.
Excuse me. I wanted. Oh.
Okay,
If
Cheryl,
I
then
may.
Liz.
Sorry, I just wanted to tie this into the last question about using magic as a metaphor for growth. Because my characters are mostly in their 20s, but they're still really immature, They just want to smoke and drink and party and get into bar fights and stuff like that. But, when they, it may be cliche, but with great power comes great responsibility. And, a lot of urban fantasy is obviously inspired by comics. And that's also why I love the urban fantasy of Nasri Noor, whose characters are really flawed, really, kind of punk, they're jerks, but they're cool and they're relatable and they grow throughout the story.
Okay. Liz?
Yes. So I think during the Singing Bones trilogy, Dani really has to grapple with a lot. That's my protagonist, because she has a lot of abandonment issues with her dad, who had PTSD and sort of ran away from everything and couldn't stay in one place for very long. And so she's always, and then in Distant Early Warning, she finds out that her dad has somehow died and turned into this sort of cross between a zombie and a banshee called a screamer. And she has to go and figure out what happened to him and try to put him down. And so she's sort of grappling with the balance between attachment to people and her abandonment fears. But what really breaks things open for her is her power. Everyone thinks the screamers are screaming, and they think that they're driving people crazy and that there's something really horrible and toxic about them. But actually, if you can hear what they're saying, they are singing. And the people that are doing weird things are people who are guilty, or they were part of whatever had to do with this particular screamer or that kind of thing. And so Dani's very empathetic, and so she's one of the people who can always hear them. And so it sort of breaks open her empathy, and she has to face that she needs connections with other people. And I don't think I'm spoiling too much in the second book to say that she ends up having to deal with a very angry young girl like she once was, and sort of try to save her so that she can help rather than hurt everyone, because she's Tessa's in self-destruct mode, and Dani has to sort of pull her back from the edge because they don't have very many singers and they need her. So it's sort of this whole almost like empathy redemption cycle for Dani.
Okay. People good with that? All right. Now, one thing that I want to address, magic is an allegory for science in urban fantasy and suspicions, because we've had all this thing of anti-vaxxers, and I think these people having, people who are anti-science, anti-common sense is one of the downsides of our more tolerant culture, because if you're going to tolerate one thing, you have to tolerate another. I'm not into stifling anybody. I don't necessarily listen to them, but I'm not into saying they shouldn't say things. So has anybody dealt with things like that where, yes, the magical person or the minority person is a bit of a jerk, but they have to be allowed their voice because everybody deserves their voice? Has anybody played with that in an urban fantasy kind of way? Liz?
So this is in one of my high fantasy books, but I think it's very applicable here. So this one hasn't been published yet, but I'm doing the edits on it right now. I have a character who has become who has to learn magic, who comes from a non-magical, very Christian allegory, puritanical kind of a culture that wants nothing to do with magic, and everybody, who does magic is a witch, and then she is attached. She has a ghost attached to her, the ghost of a witch queen, basically, and so there's a hilarious scene where they have different versions of a story. They both have the same story of the same historical figure, Felice, and they're both telling it their way. And so Ivy tells the story in that, Felice found the undead queen, and the undead queen seduced her into dark ways, and then she went off and had demon children, and this is why you should never walk on the road at night. But some of the factual descriptions of the undead city were, sort of more plausible than what was in the witching culture version, which was that, she was this hero who made a deal with death, and there was all this metaphor and that kind of thing. And so they have this argument where there's bits of truth in each of their stories, and they're like, well, this is far more plausible than your version, and they're just kind of they're both laughing at parts of the other person's story that seem implausible, but also, sort of clinging to their own version. It's very funny, but that's kind of how I dealt with that particular theme.
So this isn't necessarily like magic, but I would say like vampire magic in this sense. So in my series, vampires can either be born or they can be bitten. They're not considered the undead. There's a longer history behind why they're vampires, but there can be a prejudice between some characters who are born pure vampires versus those who are bitten. And one of the characters, Frala, who is high up in the coven, gives another character, Trish, a hard time when she's brought into the coven. Now, Trish was force changed. She didn't ask to be changed into a vampire. She was force changed, had a sire who was just awful to her, and she's just trying to find her footing in the coven and make a good example of who she is and show that bitten born are just as good as those who are born vampires. And Frala just gives her crap the whole time. She is and she's just a really rude, mean character in there. And her companion kind of tries to cool her down a little bit to be like, she's still she's our sister. She belongs with us and everything. Frala's just not having it. She just hates Trish's guts simply because she was bitten born.
There's some interesting allegories. It's not a majority view among Norse pagans, but there are some Norse pagan sites, individuals who are very much, if you do not have a Norse heritage, you can't study Norse paganism, and they just try to shut you out. And that unfortunately has happened with North American First Peoples spiritual practices as well. It's not everybody, but there's a small minority in almost every group that is tries to be exclusionary. And it's true of more minorities as well as the majority, which it's great allegory to bring it to light and show it for the ridiculous garbage it is. Okay. Do you consciously go out to try to, okay, I think we all can agree, fiction, first duty of fiction, to entertain. Within that context, do you consciously try to do a little bit of education along the way to slip past the people's barriers and get something into their skulls? And we'll go with Alex because you're top right of my screen. No other reason for the order.
Okay. Pretty much I try to slip in, things about, especially because he's young when he starts off, a lot of bullying, a lot of solitude, and what happens when you're in that sort of a lifestyle and mindset, and you're kind of afraid of opening up and afraid of talking to people. I try to address how he's afraid of speaking out, and when he sees other people being bullied, he shies away and doesn't acknowledge what's going on because he knows he could be next. So it's a constant example of things that go bad, and people who are pushing hate. They'll continue to do it as long as nobody's stopping them. And only when you stand up to these bad elements, will you be able to put an end to it. So when it begins, it's all he's very quiet and shy, and everything's something that he wants to keep away from. He even stays away from his friends. But as time goes on, he begins to stand up. Even when he loses, he knows that he kept someone else from being victimized. So he's actually proud of him being able to throw himself in between these abusers and some helpless kid at school. So it's something I throw in there on a regular basis. I think almost every book I've written so far in it has a form of a bully or one way or another. And I try to make sure that you can see the way different people react to it, especially all the other characters, the other kids. Some of them shy away from it. Some of them actually are mentally scarred by it. And I show that in a couple of the books where you can actually see the results and why it's something that shouldn't be allowed.
Okay. Cheryl?
Again, I want to kind of tie this into the last question because, I grew up in a very Spanish Catholic household, but look at me now reading books on paganism and Norse mythology and stuff like that. And it's, I don't know, it's just important, I think, to be inclusive, I guess, of other beliefs, even those not your own, or that maybe you don't even fully understand. Like Alex was saying, the character might be a little shy or scared at first, but they grow and learn to stand up for themselves and stand up to others as well, and to protect other people.
Okay. Catherine?
So in terms of whether I consciously put it in or not, I consciously added in planning rather than in writing. And usually it's, I want to put in a character who is or represents this, marginalized group or whatever. And once I define the character, then it's just a matter of what do they do in the situations that they end up in. And I remember reading something recently from, I think it was a fairly big name author, who said on the topic of themes in your work, that if you're passionate about a subject, then that theme's automatically going to show through. You don't have to, literally focus on it. And I think that's generally what I try to do. I bring it in terms of the character. Like, I've got a character here. Well, this character has vitiligo, so he gets stared at wherever he goes. And, people treat him differently because he looks differently. And so what reaction does that cause within the story as it goes? And so when I write a story, I have like the basic plot figured out, but I need to have that leeway for how do the characters react and how does that background bring that out in the story.
Okay. Elizabeth?
I would say that I never I never aim to be up on a soapbox, but at the same time, basically my entire body of work is about empathy. It's about empathy. It's about the other. One of my goals in writing and producing, narrative art of any kind is to make people feel less alone, because I was that kid that was reading a fantasy novel alone in a hallway for most of high school, even when I should have been in a class. Like, I would cut class and I would go sit in the hallway and I would go read a fantasy novel. And if I can pay that forward in any way and, make somebody who has been in a really bad abusive situation or is bullied or just feels different and like they don't fit in any way, to feel like somebody sees them, that's 100% my mission in writing fiction.
Okay. Erin?
I would say, so kind of like with Catherine, a lot of it comes in during the planning stages, and I I definitely follow a lot of similar themes within my books. So I guess similar messages and teaching for my readers. The main one is the importance of community. Like in the Purple Door District, the districts themselves are safe locations for parahumans. So no matter what parahuman you are, you can all live in this community. You can all feel safe together. It's governed over by a Violet Marshal who makes sure there's peace amongst all the different types of parahumans. And the reason why community is so important is not just because I run a writing organization trying to bring writers together, but when I grew up, I felt very alone as a writer. I didn't have writer friends. I didn't have a place to go to write with other people. I felt really lost, alone, and basically, like Liz said, kind of immersed myself in my books and not with other people. And if I can help people feel like there are others out there who understand where they're coming from and that there's a community out there for them, then I've done my job with my books. And I will say one of my biggest things is what I would love to see come out of people reading my books is the inspiration to write and to tell their own stories. Because if one person decides I want to be a writer based on the stuff I've written, then I've done my job as a writer. And especially if they feel like they have found a community or found a home, that they are not alone. It's just I want that for my readers, because we aren't alone. I mean, all of us, we all share the passion for love and writing, but especially during times of COVID, we're all separate and it's so easy to feel lost and forgotten, but we're still coming together as a community. We're still part of one another's lives.
Okay.
Beautifully
Heidi?
said.
Oh,
Thank you.
yes. Heidi? Do you want to add something? No? Okay.
No, sorry, I'm dealing with a tech issue. You guys are doing great, though. Love it.
Okay. Have fun. All right. We're coming up on the hour, so I think that why don't each one of us take a turn to give a brief thing about our books. I'll lead off. I have Nuki Kubai and Worlds Apart in the urban fantasy genre, as well as others, but those are my urban fantasies. Nuki Kubai is feasting on the people of Toronto, and Ray McAndrews, a modern-day wizard, decides that he has got to put a stop to this. Only it soon becomes a question of who's hunting who. And Worlds Apart, a wizard from a parallel Earth journeys to our world in a bid to stop a blight that is destroying his own. Here he meets Alcina, a Wiccan priestess who is involved in a custody battle against her ex-boyfriend, Carl, who has the backing of a fanatic religious cult in his attempt to take Tim. Tim is her son, and the fanatic religious cult is not above doing an old-fashioned witch burning if they don't get their way. Marcus helps Alcina, Alcina helps Marcus, but there's complications. Okay, Cheryl?
All right. Well, as I've mentioned before, The Black Moon of Lilith is about someone who finds the Grim Reaper's cloak. And as also discussed before, magic in my story is kind of a metaphor for being kind of torn between worlds, you know, one foot in the real world and one in magic. And that's also a metaphor, kind of like what Erin said earlier about being bi and not really fitting into gay culture or straight culture, and also about being biracial, not fitting into white culture or Hispanic culture, or not fitting into Catholic culture or pagan culture. So this book is going to be the first of a series called The Land of Entrapment that will continue to explore these themes.
Okay. Catherine?
So the series that I'm currently working on is the Sisters of Chaos trilogy. It's an epic fantasy trilogy. We have book 1, Enduring Chaos, and book 2, The Unseen Force. This one just came out last summer. And it's about a young woman with a gift she can't control who is caught up in a battle for revenge as old as the gods themselves.
Okay. Liz?
So my book, Distant Early Warning, the start of the Singing Bones trilogy, is available from Renaissance Press for pre-order. You can get it on Amazon. You can also get it on Renaissance's website. It's launching April the 15th, and we're going to have some really fun viral videos and some online launch activities as well going on. So keep an eye out for that. I'm Hirst_author on Twitter. To describe Distant Early Warning, I did a little bit earlier, but Denny is an isolated teacher's assistant living in St. Catharines, Ontario, who is kind of far from the crisis that's going on, where the dead are rising from the grave in the north at night and screaming and driving people south and causing a refugee crisis. And when Denny sees her father on TV as one of these monsters, she takes his dog, who arrived several weeks earlier mysteriously at her house, and quits her job and goes into a Wild West without the West, filled with these monsters to try and put him to rest.
Okay. Erin?
Well, first of all, Liz, congrats on your new book coming out. That's super exciting. So
Thank you,
just
Erin.
had to say that. So I'm Erin Casey. I'm author of the Purple Door District series. The first one is about a werebird named Bianca who's being chased by hunters, so she has no idea why. Her only chance to survive is to find the Purple Door District of Chicago, a safe haven for parahumans like ourselves. But the hunters are relentless. So it's up to the Purple Door District, full of werewolves, vampires, magi, witches, to save Bianca and their community from the dark force that threatens them. Wolf Pit is the sequel that follows a year and a half later, with a focus on learning more about the werewolves and the magi in the district. Book 3 should be coming out this fall or this winter. You can find my books at erincasey.org to get signed copies. I will also link, and on Amazon, I will also link my information in the comments below. I have a special giveaway to do both books for $25.
And we're just about to wrap it up, but I want to encourage everybody to check out the rest of LitCon. There are cover wars, and I think I saw your cover there, Erin, and my cover is up there. And this is important to Brain Lag because this lovely lady was the one who designed it, Catherine. And so check out cover wars, check out the other panels. I'm sure we're all on other panels. And well, really, thank you for attending, and I hope there was something elucidating about this. Okay.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you for hosting, Stephen.
Thank
you for
you.
inviting us.